So the concept that it seems to really resonate with a lot of people is one of imaginary rules. You and I had chatted a bit prior to this, but the concept of imaginary rules is really that as we grow up, as we develop, we are surrounded by certain people, certain environments, certain kind of ecosystems that reinforce not just the good rules that we learn. For example, the good manners that we have, the moral compass that we develop, but they're, reinforcing what is possible for us. They are giving us a narrative about who we are and what we can achieve and what we can do that most people will end up adhering to. If you look back at your high school, what did they do with their lives? What kind of careers did they end up choosing? There's kind of this really interesting range, and then there's going to be a few outliers. And so for the people who are in that narrative, people will say travel, get out, have conversations with other people, because those are the things that start changing the way we see the world, and it changes the way we see ourselves and what is possible. If these individuals who are growing up and ingesting these narratives, there are certain things about the rooms they belong in, the kind of conversations they should have, the kind of money they can make. And so to me, these are I call them imaginary rules because I think that people operate according to them and it ends up limiting their life. And this happens to people in early stages, but surprisingly, it happens in later stages too, where people will say, oh, doing this would be greedy, or doing this would be, it should be enough. Or that there should be, I don't know that I should take this kind of risk, or they don't want to do certain other things. What I'm hoping is that when people can look at their life and they look at their experiences, that they aren't setting artificial ceilings on who they can become because of what they've seen and ingested about their environment or who they are or what they're capable of. And, parents are doing the best that they can, but often, they are giving you advice that is applicable from the world that they know. And so it's not that it's poorly intended. Even your friends are not always poorly intended, but they're often very limiting because of the limited span and kind of surface area that they have in the world. So that's one area of looking at personal narrative, looking at psychology in that way, to kind of begin to unlock how do people look at what's possible? Because I hear all the time, if you are on Twitter, you'll see that people will say, oh, every wealthy person has exploited others, or like these themes that come up that are not necessarily true. And these are all coming from narratives, stories that they've heard. And if you think that way, you're actually pushing against the thing that could really benefit your life.
How do you think the internet's changed imaginary rules? Like, now all of a sudden we have way more examples of what is possible in the world than, oh wow, look at this person doing this, and look at that. Like that to me is really exciting because of how many imaginary rules I feel like might get broken or might have been broken in the past 10, 20 years.
I agree. I think the internet has done two things. It's increased exposure, but hidden methods, right? Like if you see the Kardashians, they have incredible wealth and they've done incredible things around, Kris Jenner was an airline stewardess at one point, right? So she certainly has had quite a journey. But what you don't see are all of the work behind the scenes and what it takes to reach those levels. And so people have the assumption that if I just, kind of do brand partnerships, I'll become, just like this. Like they kind of don't see the work it takes to get to some of those outcomes. So now they see the outcome as possible, but I think that the actual work in between becomes very dejecting for them, very hard, very challenging, because that's the stuff that's hidden. Nobody is documenting, the real work it takes to, if for 8 years or 7 years or 10 years to get to a certain point, it looks like, they've been successful this entire time. Gary Vee is a great example where, he's making videos on YouTube that nobody watches for a very long time in his 30s, I believe. And now, certainly he's doing incredible things. He's reached incredible heights. He continues to go. And one day that guy's going to buy the jets. So I do think that We miss the work is often excluded. And so people are also tempted to falsify their lives, right? Because they want to kind of show that they're also a part of this, this wealth or this achievement, but they really haven't earned it. And I think it creates a lot of emptiness in people's lives and feelings of emptiness because they can't back it up. I think there's something very destructive about becoming a kind of a false reflection of something that you don't have. It really does make people struggle.
Yeah. And I mean, putting yourself out on the internet is something that we are the first people to ever do. And that's like a kind of crazy thing if you think about it, where you're creating a reflection of yourself that is hopefully as in alignment with the person that you are. But if it's not, it will cause you psychic disarm. Like you will be harmed by that reality. And I think that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about how our reality will be different when we present a different reality of ourselves on the internet than what actually exists in our heart.
I agree with you. I think that as we put ourselves online, we have to be very intentional about how we do that so that it is the truest reflection of ourselves. But what's really fascinating to me are the people who have strategies that make it work for them and protect themselves in the process. So, for example, someone who is fairly well known that I had worked with in the past said that they are intentional to present online and on social media a version of themselves that is true, but that they keep back an entire portion of themselves that is not online at all. And they do that intentionally so that when someone criticizes them, that it's like, well, you don't even really know me. Whereas if you put everything out there and someone criticizes you, it can feel like kind of a wound of sorts. But there's a separation that we have to have where we say, okay, this is me authentically, but it's only a part of me. And the rest of myself that is precious and, something that is more tender or authentic that, I want to keep solely for me. And being able to do that is very protective, but also allows you a lot of room to push forward. People, should have something behind the veil so that they have something intimate for their friends and partners and whomever, and the world can get a certain piece of you, and then the rest should stay with, your home life and other places that you might want to be.
Yeah. It is interesting, though, that every year people feel more and more comfortable sharing more aspects of themselves. And I always think about, like, at what cost is that? And maybe the next generation will grow up where everything is online. But personally, I just don't feel comfortable doing that. And I can imagine that there might be some regret with sharing everything, or it might just be normal and that's just the way the world works. But
I think that there is an epidemic of loneliness that I think prompts people to want to share and connect with people online when they're not able to connect with people in the real world for whatever reason. And most of our relationships, even most of our dating relationships, are now found online. So I do think that people put themselves out there with good intention, but it does put them more at risk of being, kind of injured or, feeling left when people do not treat them in the way that they hoped to be received.
You mentioned imaginary rules before, and I'm curious, what is an example of an imaginary rule you had that a few months, years later down the line, you realize, like, oh, that was just a rule I was making up in my head?
So I think that an imaginary rule I had was what a wealthy person looked like. I thought, growing up on a farm, you don't see, in rural kind of Pennsylvania, you don't see a lot of truly wealthy people. So I thought that a wealthy person was like a physician. That was a wealthy person. And, certainly as I went to grad school and, the Gold Coast of Connecticut has a lot of incredible homes, you start to see that, not only is the wealthy person probably not a physician, although they do quite well, and some can do very well, but that, wealth is not rare. It is not uncommon. It is not unreachable. It is not held only by certain people that, and I remember going to I was invited to go to a Yankees game, and I sat next to a guy who invented an app that, he made millions of dollars on this app. And I remember just thinking to myself, it's so funny how if you bring those stories back and you start telling people like, yeah, you can make millions of dollars creating this app, there are still people who believe that that isn't a path to wealth, right? That you could only do this through certain areas. And so I think that my lens certainly had shifted from, growing up in rural Pennsylvania to, going to even graduate school and seeing, more people and getting more exposure. It certainly has been beneficial for me, and it continues to be beneficial. It's, I think that expanding your range and expanding your lens and speaking with different people, you start to see what is possible, and it makes you play bigger knowing that it's not unique.
That makes sense. When you think about the clients that you work with today, some of the wealthiest people, and so I assume that their imaginary rules aren't around money. What are their imaginary rules typically around?
I think that their imaginary rules begin to be around other things. So, for example, a lot of times you almost have to remind people of the impact that they can have. I've had people who have had very significant exits, for example, who are like, what can I do now? What's something I can do next? You make, almost $1 billion on something, or, something that hundreds of millions of dollars. And you kind of have this unlimited choices. And so it really almost feels quite paralyzing, but you don't realize that the person who had this large exit is you, and that this money actually is something that you can use to make a big impact in society. I think people forget that. So I think the imaginary rule there is like, I'm still just a founder, or I'm just a CEO, or I'm just a what have you. And they forget that, like, if you wanted to, you could build a hospital in XYZ and have incredible impact. You could, if there's a cause that you believe in, you have the resources to create change. Like, you can really take yourself now to another level of operation where you can impact millions and, millions of people. You can impact their health. You can impact, a species. If you're really interested in a certain animal or population, you can impact disease. You can impact, like, the levels of impact, I think, are still an area where people feel like, oh, me, I can do that. And the resources that they have, I think, are surprising even to them. And many operate very similarly to kind of when they didn't have quite as much. I mean, a lot of them have been doing well for a very long time. So having an exit like that isn't really going to change the style of life much, depending on what their situation is. If the company, they own the company versus, it's funded. I mean, there's a lot of dynamics that would go into that. But I think they still need to be reminded of impact, who they are, what they can do, what they can influence. And it becomes incredibly empowering.
If you enjoyed this clip, watch the full episode right over here, and don't forget to subscribe.